I'm Seamless, and today is Tuesday, which doesn't really mean anything really, but today is going to be another How to Bass, and today I'm going to show you how to make this sound. Yeah. No face cam today. I'm kind of sick and I feel loopy. It's a mess in here and I don't feel like dealing with it, so we're just going to do this. It's okay though, and there's a random How to Bass in the middle of the week because I'm still behind on them and I want to be caught up, so I'm doing, you get a How to Bass in the middle of the week. This guy was kind of fun. This is another Serum dude, and then a bunch of other business, but I am using the old Vocoder as opposed to Vocodex because it does still have some tricks up its sleeves that are pretty cool. The big reverb you're hearing is probably big reverb, and how that works out is pretty interesting. Plus ye old bandpass and some stuff, but with slight adjustments into how I go about doing it. Compression, more EQ, and that's really all it. And also a little bit of shenanigans in Serum itself. So let's begin from the beginning. This is what the Serum sounds like without anything. I don't know how loud it is. It sounds like a it sounds like a hardstyle kick. Do it, totally. And this has a whole bunch of effects on as well, so we're gonna turn all of them off. This here, the oscillator sounds like by itself, because this is just the one oscillator plus a sub. I have the sub happening here. Without the sub, it's just that. So what's happening here is that I chose the MB triangle. Apparently, I actually, like, when I was like these days when I'm messing around with Serum, kind of what I do is I like do what I'm doing, and then I just sort of like this one, that one, this one, that one, and then like whatever modulations I have are still there, but they're just applying itself to different things. And that's what I have been doing here. So this oscillator has like that going on. Let's turn that up. That's kind of what it's doing. But the warp mode I'm using is the bend mode, and this is what I'm doing with the warp mode. Remap rather. And what that does, that shape, we can kind of look at it here, is it's kind of squishing the bits together. So if I do like a more direct version of it, it would be a little bit like this. And this is pretty handy when you're messing with it to kind of like have the knob there and look at what you're doing, because like you see how it's kind of like squishing the business together. Well, the opposite of that pulls it apart. And it's a little bit like what the asymmetry does, the asymmetry warp mode. Well, I'm pretty sure asymmetry uses straight line versions of it because they don't seem as curvy when they do it. The other guy is it's more like this, and like whatever direction I settled on, it was mostly random choice at the time. Yeah, that's kind of what it looked like. And this separation though, what it does is that it it forces the sharp parts to kind of be farther apart from the flat parts, and that creates a slightly bitier tone. Given this particular table has a whole bunch going on, like you can see when it's all the way up there that like that really matters. Like in the lower bits when it's just a triangle wave, it's not super important, but like when there's extra harmonic stuff happening, it all gets crushed in these particular locations, which comes across as a much sharper thing. Higher values sharper, lower values not so much. Either of those, like the macro I have attached to it isn't really doing the entire remap part of it, but it's still doing most of it. So it's like a little bit of both worlds there. And of course, the main wavetable is being modulated as well. Also, that little bit you heard there is actually in the MIDI with a whole other note playing on top of this note to get us that Reese kind of unison effect. That's really all that's happening there. I do also have pitch bend happening manually. I'm just automating it. I set it to 2 octaves, and I'm all, like the way that I tend to handle these automation clips when I do that is that I will right click on the default value, which is usually 50%, and then I'll do whatever changes I want to do, and then if I want to go back at the end of it, I'll just paste value, and that's the end of that. Probably should have not made a whole bunch of these. Would have been faster if I used step edit mode. Good job, me. So that's the beginning of the oscillator. Yes. Now, in the effects portion, what began first was compression. Now, the compression is a little insane. It's kind of ridiculous. And then also with distortion involved, it got kind of harsh. But not in the, not in the way that you're thinking. Like when the word harsh comes around, people tend to imagine sort of higher frequency activity being a thing. And, you know, there's a lot of that going on. But at the time that I made this decision, I used a different table with this EQ. I'm building up to why I have this EQ the way this is. Because what the EQ is doing is that it's set to a particular point, but it's controlled by the note positioning on the frequency value. And it was to solve a problem that now that I'm going through this again, I realize it doesn't exist anymore, but it does also contribute to the tone, so like that's why it's there. What this did initially is that you've probably experienced when you distort things that like the 200, 500 range tends to be overrepresented in the mud that comes out, and you could either EQ it after the distortion or you could EQ it before the distortion. When you EQ it before the distortion, you're not completely removing the problem. You are, however, shaping the character of it so that it might not be a problem. That's an interesting way to approach it. And then I have a high pass filter to high pass it because I use the EQ, and then I have the sub on direct out, so we have the slightly distorted sine wave coming out. And this loud, obnoxious sound is getting put into the EQ, which is doing the pre-business, and then into the vocoder. It's not a vocodex. It's actually the old vocoder. This is the fruity vocoder that had been around since, I want to say, version 4. I don't remember if it was in 3, but I honestly wasn't as good at this when I was using version 3, so I wouldn't know, to be perfectly honest. And that's what that's doing. Now, the whole reason I'm using the fruity vocoder is because of these knobs right here. Well, mostly these knobs. This knob helps. These knobs are okay. And this is, I would normally automate this, but it didn't actually make that big a difference in terms of motion, but it does make a bit of a difference in terms of character. We'll talk about that when we get to the end because it's not as apparent. But these min and max settings and these scale settings are basically this vocoder's version of the band distribution window inside Vocodex. If you looked at the last database where I explained how the band distribution window works with visual aids, you know that the whole point of it is that these bands that show up in the vocoder have a position in the spectrum, in the frequency spectrum. And the old vocoder doesn't show them move around like the new one does. It just shows the static bands the way they are and the levels that they have. But they get represented in the spectrum in a specific location. And the min, max, and scale determines how those bands are distributed. The minimum value determines the lowest frequency value that it can occupy. The maximum value determines the highest frequency value it can occupy. Occupy. Damn. You get the point. And then the scale determines the weighting. So instead of it being evenly distributed like this would be if this were the case, it would be that there are more on one side or the other or more on the other side versus the first one. And that's what this knob does. When brought all the way down this way, it orders it in a way that's a bit more congruent with a note's frequency profile. What I mean by that is that a regular, like a saw wave, for example, has less harmonics in the bottom than it does at the top because it's not evenly distributed. It's evenly distributed according to octaves, not according to hertz values. See up here, you can see octaves evenly distributed, but hertz values not. This is the typical way of looking at a frequency spectrum because it's not that helpful when most of their frequencies exist in a range that we don't really mess with a lot. So looking at it this way is much more musically relevant, and putting them in the scale in this direction makes it orient in that way. Not perfectly in that way, mind you. It's not like note following now, but it is just, it's getting away from that typical vocoder sound which is present when they are evenly distributed. The vocoder sound is also present because of the fact that we're splitting everything into bands, but if we change the distribution of it, then that particular quality isn't as well, it's actually exactly as apparent, but it's not what you're used to hearing. It's not the exact same like vocoder thing that happens. Yeah, so another kind of benefit is that when we're automating the min value and the scales like that, it acts a little bit like a high-pass filter. Just more like a high-pass phaser, if you want to think of it that way. Now, I'm also automating the bandwidth, and we can kind of hear that happening when we get the low values, when we hear like this. That kind of metallic moment there, that is the low bandwidth sound. And that's also the sort of like glassy vocoder sound you tend to expect. But when you fade in a little bit like not like a little bit like, because that's like all the way, but I mean a little bit in terms of like time. Like it's not on all the time, but it's on a little bit of the time. It doesn't become as annoying, and it becomes a kind of accent, at least for me. Then we're going to compress the whole thing. Now, I pretty much have to do this when we're using vocoders because they break stuff up in such a way that makes it so that just the whole spectrum isn't as representative as it was a minute ago, which is a good thing given that the original sound was harsh as balls, but we don't want it to be so gone. So the way that this is working is that I'm focusing a lot on the higher frequencies. You can sort of see that like the low ends is pumping up kind of hard and the high ends pumping up kind of hard, because these are the ends that tend to get the most ruined by vocoders. The low end is almost always gone because of the high passing nature of it. And like, even though I have the separate sub coming out of Serum deliberately, because the first thing that it encounters is this, that sub is more or less gone. A good idea would be to high pass this thing and have a separate sub, but I tend not to do these and do that in how to bases. Especially since the last time I tried doing that when I automated pitch like this, it got weird. So that'll be up to y'all to solve in your own projects. But kind of crushing it. Wow, loudest stuff. And like the peaking is huge because I'm actually not using the master limiter on this. And I realized for years when I've been doing this, I've been doing like bam, 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 and then more or less sampling on the master. And like there's nothing wrong with that really. It works, but it tends to get me, after I use a lot of them, somewhere that's a little bit hard to deal with. So recently I've been like, well, do I really need to limit it again after I limited it multiband? And the answer is no. No, I don't. Because it's going to get crushed down again after I do the stuff I'm going to do to it. However, in the meantime, it does mean that we are making it epically loud. Hey, look how far above 0 this goes. This is the wonderful thing about you having 32-bit floating point as your bit depth as opposed to 24-bit or 16-bit, because you can go above 0 and you still have your stuff. Just as long as you come back down at the end of it, you still have your peaks. So it means that even though they are wildly above 0 dB, I guess not that much above it, plus 9 maybe, then the dynamics of it still are being processed properly, which is a cool thing. Then I have the Convolver, and I have a thing in here, but I did some stuff to it. This guy, so like the way that Convolution Reverb works, if you're unfamiliar with it, is that you grab yourself an impulse. This is that impulse. However, it was a little bit longer, so what I did was I deleted the end of it and then I faded it out. Inside Convolver, you click on this button to let you actually use your keyboard shortcuts, but if you don't have that on, you have to actually use like edits and whatever. Turn it on, here, hit delete, and then Alt F is the keyboard shortcut to create a fade out. So basically, I shortened the length of this guy because I like the initial sound that it created onto the result, but the tail lasted way, way too long. Gotta remember to turn keyboard input off though if you want to have it open and still like hit the transport controls. Yeah, so other cool things that the Convolver can do is that it has a stereo separation knob just right up in there, which is nice. It also got the stretch knob, which this is a sample that it's using. So the stretch, for it to apply, like if you want a longer version of the same reverb, you're literally making the sample longer. And in this case, that's what's happening. Just a little bit after I made the cuts. There's also the built-in EQ. Neat thing about these EQs is that it's linear phase, so you don't get a lot of the phasing problems with your reverb EQ, but because it's also reverb EQ, you don't really have to care. The value of this reverb isn't going to become apparent until after we do the next things that happen, which is this EQ here. The reverb actually came one of the last things, and normally I would have done the stereoizing of the sound in the beginning. I would have done it in Serum because there's a lot of things that Serum can do that are really good. However, because I'm using the vocoder, the old vocoder, it's not a stereo processor. It is universally the left-right encoding, as opposed to the Vocodex, which it can actually just like have individual channel encoding where it does it by stereo. I could have done this stereo if I like loaded up a patcher and did 2 of these and had all the same controls or whatever. But in the actual sound design process, that's a big pain in the butt. So I didn't want to do that. It's really all there is to that. If I really, really, really wanted to like it needed to have stereo at the beginning, then I would have just used 2 of these. Yeah, I don't really blame this for that because it totally does have a replacement plugin that does everything better, but, you know, just saying. Yeah, so then the next part is yield bandpass and some stuff, but what's cool about this is I'm automating a lot more, but a little bit different. I'm using a bandpass filter, whoop-de-doo. I am keeping it on mode 2, rather, which is a little bit interesting because it calls it order 2, which I'm not totally sure what point of that is. It must be dB. Is that 2 dB? So we have like steeps and gentles of different dB amounts, I think, maybe? I'm really kind of blanking on what those numbers indicate. But the difference between the middle value and those other values is that those other values like actually cut at the end of the pass. Whereas this guy leaks on every end, which is actually super great for this because when you do this kind of filtering to things, you lose almost all your level because you're filtering out most of it. So having a leak means that if I compress it hard enough of what I want to come back will come back. But I'm automating this. I'm the frequency of it. I'm also automating the bandwidth of this particular guy, and I'm also automating 3 different peak filters. This guy, and this guy. Normally what I would do is I would do band stops. I would have a band pass and band stop. Now what a band stop does, unlike a peak filter, is that a band stop just cuts a hole in the thing, and that's the end of it. A peak filter is a filter that can go positive or negative and not all the way. It doesn't like cut a thing. It just reduces the thing, attenuates a thing. I elected to do these instead of my usual notching business because that's always just been a very what's the word I'm looking for? It's not harsh. It's not, I guess, final. Kind of a very final thing to do to a frequency spectrum because, like, for the moment, like, for the actual range of the band stop, they're gone. And some of those, like, bubbly sounds that come around and some of my older sounds were more or less from that, along with different, like, how fast and what frequencies the bandpass itself is automating. The peaks are essentially lighter versions of that, which means that they don't, like, have the same problems. I'm not saying they don't have different problems, but they don't have the same problems. So that's what I'm automating. And so, like, here's the macro from the serum. Here's the starting, the vocoder high pass, we can call it that. Here's the band pass, the main band pass. Here's the band pass width, and then here's the 3 peak filters. As far as what specific, like, locations I'm going on, it just as always, I just kind of put stuff down and move it around until it's sounded right. The specific form into qualities is something that this is kind of building over time. Usually the way I would approach this is that I would try as hard as I can to make it as formaty as possible at every step, which you can do, and which I have done, and sometimes it's totally baller. But in this case, what I've done is that every step individually doesn't really make it something that's that particular quality, but it kind of adds up. And then not only is it doing it at the end, but is doing it with an interesting kind of quality, a more sort of layered quality to it because it adds up to a thing versus just being a bunch of things. Either approach has their place, mind you. And this is the bandwidth for the vocoder, and this is the pitch bend. They are labeled. Indeed. So with this filter, you can hear how it's basically doing that. And of course, we lose all of that, so we can press it again. And this time I did use the master limiter because we are coming back to it. But also look how the bands are situated here. This particular choice was actually less about because I wanted these sections to be like this than it was that, like, after I was doing it, because they're more or less all compressed just as hard, that, like, where the split is actually affects the quality of that particular area of the frequency spectrum. There's a mode in here called linear phase filters where it'll switch it to a filter configuration that doesn't affect the phase of the split as much as the regular mode does. And boy, does the regular mode ever. Like, watch what happens when I'm just moving around the low end. Like, you hear that? How, like, it got like a different kind of muddy, and we also kind of lost bass a little bit. If you solo these bands, we can sort of see what makes sense about this. See, this is the section of the area of the frequency, but when we have the activity on, we can see that it's actually bleeding quite a bit over. So if I actually wanted this area to be there, I have to, like, move it around until it is. And that's rather low. And the same thing with the higher values. You might have been thinking to yourself, okay, I heard when you soloed the bass there that it actually didn't sound super great. Like when it was soloed. So how is it that it sounded kind of okay when all the stuff was together? And that isn't so much an intentional choice on my part as it is just the nature of things, where in the low end, we heard some high frequency distortion on some frequencies that wouldn't have been there if they weren't being compressed the way they were. And other things. And as a result, that's what distortion is. It just adds harmonics and stuff. That's probably from the top also. It might just be from here that's doing that, honestly. Point being is that as long as you have enough other higher frequency stuff going on, it'll blend in and it won't sound so bad in context. We don't really need to worry about like the purity of particular frequencies. The bleeding is gonna happen, and for the most part, bleeding is what you want. One more EQ. That's just really, really light stuff. And that's the sound. I have this edit in here because I wanted to see what it sounded like reversed, and turns out not that interesting. So that's why it didn't stick. But yeah. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. The FLP will be available to download in the description of this video, as will the Serum preset by itself, just in case you want that. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And as usual, have a nice day. Da, 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 da.